Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, December 19th, 2020, and today we're going to be talking about why the Democratic Party should be hopeful entering into the 2024 presidential election. Now, before you say anything, I will be making another video discussing why the Democratic Party should also be worried about the 2024 election. There are two things that are happening here. The Democratic Party did make significant gains amongst white voters in this election that they could possibly retain the same way Donald Trump retained those Obama to Trump voters from 2016 to 2020, but the Republican Party made gains amongst minority voters. However, in 2024, we won't see as many effects from the Trump wing of the Republican Party, which was surprisingly able to appeal to more minorities than they did in 2016. But looking ahead to 2024, I don't necessarily think that's something that's going to occur, but we will discuss why the Democratic Party should be worried entering into 2024. So two things can be equally true. We're going to be talking about the pluses entering into the election, what on the electoral map makes sense for the Democratic Party, and what actually would be a pathway to victory entering past this election. So we all know how this election ended up. Joe Biden won with 306 electoral votes, but he didn't exactly win in certain states that the Democratic Party was still fighting for, spent tens of millions of dollars in. We're talking about North Carolina and Florida. But entering into 2024, these states are going to hold a larger electoral weight, which means if the Republican Party retains them, that's going to be an additional 3 more electoral votes the Republican Party can add to their column. In fact, based off the 2020 results, Joe Biden would only receive 302 electoral votes based off the new map. Why? Because a bunch of states across the Sun Belt are gaining in population, and the states across the Rust Belt are losing electoral votes because of decreased population. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Minnesota are all set to lose 1 electoral vote following the 2020 census. In fact, there are barely any states that are above the Sun Belt that are actually gaining electoral votes. New York is losing 2. I believe the only state that's gaining 1 is Montana and Oregon, above the entire Sun Belt region. Other than that, we don't really see any increases on the East Coast. We see a decrease in Rhode Island, and we see a decrease in New York and Pennsylvania, but I really don't see it anywhere else. Even California might actually lose 1, but they definitely will not gain. So looking at this map, same type of electoral map, a lot of similar safe states from the 2020 election. We're not going to see too many surprises based off that. 4 years is not enough to completely revolutionize our electoral map the way we saw it in 2016, just because we won't see a Donald Trump-like candidate. We are probably going to see we're probably going to revert to our political system before Donald Trump entered into the ring. What do I mean by that? We're talking Mitt Romney, John McCain-esque type Republicans running. That means Nikki Haley. That means Senator Tom Cotton. That means Ted Cruz. That means plenty of notable names. Even Mike Pence is more Romney-esque than he is Trump-esque. Even though he has served under President Trump, he has definitely been the more moderate conservative, someone who's been able to appeal to a lot of American voters. He's by nowhere near Trump's level of enthusiasm. He doesn't pull the same amount of crowd sizes. However, he is a better orator, and he is a better debater, and I think that's something that could help Mike Pence if he chooses to run. But this is about the Democratic Party. Why should they be optimistic entering into the 2024 election? What actually looks good for them? Well, in the 2020 election, I don't know why I keep saying 2016. I'm not used to referring 2020 as the past, but we saw a number of swing states this election season. A number of states across the Rust Belt were competitive. A number of states across the Sun Belt were equally as competitive, and that totals up to roughly 166 electoral votes based off our new map. I'm going to characterize the states that went for the former vice president by pretty significant amounts, and then I'm actually going to characterize some of the other Republican states that we probably won't see too heavily contested entering into 2024. Honestly, I think the Democratic Party is going to be I think they're going to make a mistake. They're not going to focus too heavily on Iowa and Ohio. I think they absolutely should, but we've seen the Democratic Party give up states before, and I wouldn't be too surprised if they wanted to focus their funds on the Sun Belt rather than an already a more toxic environment for Democratic politicians in Iowa and Ohio, because after this election performance, I can see why they would be upset. But again, Michigan went to Obama by 17 points. I mentioned this in a number of videos, 17 points in 2008. 8 years later, they voted for Donald Trump. So we could see Iowa and Ohio, after 8 years of voting for Trump in 2016 and then 2020, could vote for a Democrat, but I don't think the Democratic Party is going to try to focus on it, even though I think that they should. Their money probably is better spent in a state such as Texas or Florida. Just Iowa and Ohio definitely shouldn't be neglected. But looking ahead, these are probably going to be the true swing states. Even though I think the Democratic Party should contest a lot of the other states that are not characterized right now, or at least focus funds in them, they're probably going to vote the same way they did in 2020. But with these 168 electoral votes, I think the Democratic Party has a better chance of winning them than they did in this election. Donald Trump had an appeal to these voters that we really did not expect. He lost amongst suburban voters, which was not too surprising, but he gained amongst minority voters, and I think that largely had to do with the messaging from the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party really cried wolf in 2016 when they told a lot of these minority voters that if they did not vote for Hillary Clinton, or if they voted for Donald Trump, or if Donald Trump was to somehow win the election, that their entire lives would turn around, that Donald Trump was this candidate who wanted to completely change the entire way that America worked. And in a sense, they were right. Donald Trump did implement a lot of new policies and push for a lot of new laws that were very different than under Obama. It made sense. He was a Republican, Obama was a Democrat, but a lot of what Trump did was not exactly something that was directly felt by the minority community. You see, when we saw a lot of these kids at the border, and we saw a lot of the things that were happening across the U.S.-Mexico border, that was something that I think the Democratic Party really should have capitalized on, and they did. They did use that to their political advantage. Speaking plainly, the Democratic Party used that to their advantage, and that made sense. But they didn't necessarily, I guess you could say, use it as well as they could have. I think the Democratic Party had ample opportunities to really vilify Donald Trump as someone who wasn't going to be a president for minority candidates, but the downside of that is that they did the same exact thing in 2016. I do believe that in 2016, the Clinton campaign and Democrats then really attacked Donald Trump more on what he was doing against minorities than what they did in 2020. And that was one of the main issues. I think that this election, the entire American electorate had already heard the same spiel from the Democratic Party. They had to try something new. The Biden campaign knew that their pathway to victory was not through minority voters. Even though it absolutely was, they won the election because of the overwhelming minority support. They knew that they were not aiming to convince more minorities to vote for them. They were trying to retain the Clinton base. What they did was try to expand to white voters. So their entire rhetoric changed. It was not so much about why Donald Trump wasn't necessarily good for minority voters. That came into popularity through May, June, July, through the Black Lives Matter movement. That's something that the Biden campaign did use. But they didn't push it as nearly as much as the Clinton campaign. Maybe not Black Lives Matter, because the Clinton campaign didn't really dabble into that much. But in terms of minority support from the president, the Biden campaign seemed to focus more on winning white voters than they did on expanding their minority electorate. And that's something that I also think really hurt them. So number one, in 2016, they used the same playing cards that I suggest that they should have used in 2020. I don't think they would have been as effective as they were in 2016, but if that was their entire playing style, then I think they would have done better amongst minority voters. Florida would not have shifted to the right as it did in this election. But that could have been at the expense of losing white voters. You see, the American electorate is very weird. You cannot appeal to all voters. Otherwise, we would have a candidate who could win 50 states. And that's just not going to happen. The American electorate is very weird. There are certain candidates that are going to appeal to certain demographic groups for various reasons. And it's going to be very difficult for a candidate to try to win a pro-life conservative from West Virginia, as well as a pro-choice not pro-life candidate, pro-life voter from West Virginia, or conservative, versus a pro-choice liberal from California. Those are going to be very difficult to do. And there are candidates who have tried, but many of them don't succeed. And Joe Biden was not one of those candidates who I think really tried to win every demographic group. Yes, he had Republicans speak at the DNC, and yes, he had progressives speak at the DNC, but overall, Joe Biden absolutely won the election based off liberal voters. Republicans actually voted for Trump more than they did in 2016. So I don't think that Joe Biden's victory had to do with a lot of crossover Republicans. But I think looking ahead to 2024, the Democratic Party can win minority voters and retain some of these white voters. And that's the thing that I think they should be very optimistic about. Donald Trump was able to take advantage of that reused playbook by the Democratic Party. But the thing is, Donald Trump probably won't be the candidate in 2024 on the Republican side. If he is, I don't expect him to win. But I don't think he's going to be that candidate. You see, Mitt Romney did worse than Trump. John McCain did worse than Trump amongst minority voters. Minority voters did not necessarily like Donald Trump based off approval rating, but they still voted for him in a larger margin than they did for two previous Republicans, and that was 2016. This election, they voted for him by a larger amount. But once we return to the same standard politics, I think that we could see minority voters revert back to the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party has shifted a lot of these suburban voters to a point where they probably won't return to the Republican Party in full force. That's the problem for the Republican Party. You see, minority voters have at a point in time where they have voted for Republicans. Hispanic voters in Florida, huge for George Bush in 2004 and 2000. 2008, though, huge for Obama. 2012, huge for Obama. 2016, huge for Clinton. She did phenomenal amongst Hispanic voters across the country. She narrowed down Arizona. She narrowed down Texas. She narrowed down Florida compared to Joe Biden. And if you're looking at Florida now, yes, Trump won it by 3.3%, but what happens when Trump isn't on the ballot? What happens when you have an unenthusiastic standard candidate who doesn't necessarily speak the same way as Donald Trump, isn't able to appeal to these voters the same way, can't drive up crowds the same way that Donald Trump did? The Democratic Party could absolutely take advantage of that because Donald Trump tapped into a base across the Rust Belt that the Democratic Party previously had a lock on, and now they have it back. I'm not going to say that this is a safe region. This is absolutely going to be competitive, but the Democratic Party probably has a better chance against a standard Republican than they do against Donald Trump because Donald Trump defied all expectations twice. He almost won this election. And when you're looking at Florida, this state could revert back to being an absolute swing state. I think the Republican Party will still have the slight edge, but it's not going to be out of the question that the Democratic Party wins there. That's something they should be hopeful about, especially with that 1% margin in the state of North Carolina. It is absolutely competitive. The Democratic Party would be fools to not focus on that state. It's going to be 16 electoral votes. It's very large in terms of electoral representation. It means a lot to a lot of voters and has a very large minority population. And it's growing. It's growing in North Carolina. It's growing in Florida. It makes sense that they would want to target Georgia. It makes sense they would want to target Arizona and Nevada and Texas and even Maine's 2nd District and Nebraska's 2nd District. When Donald Trump isn't on this ballot, he probably won't be able to appeal to these voters the same way. When Donald Trump isn't on the ballot, a Republican wouldn't be able to appeal to the voters the same way. Whether it's Nikki Haley, whether it's Ted Cruz, whether it's Paul Ryan. We don't know who the Republican nominee in 2024 is going to be. But I don't think they will have the same type of Trump appeal, the same type of expectation to, outdo the polls, because the polls had been accurate before Trump. Even in 2018, in midterm year between Trump's presidential elections, we still saw the polls become extremely accurate. But when Donald Trump was on that ballot, we had a pretty significant portion of the electorate that was maybe not ashamed, but did not want to tell these pollsters that they were voting for Donald Trump. But when he isn't there, and when he isn't really in the political spectrum as much as he is now, we could revert back to where we were before. But the problem is, Donald Trump and many Trump and America First Republicans have pushed away a lot of suburban voters. I do not think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have pushed away minority voters. Donald Trump was just able to win them over because his messaging was better. His messaging was better for them. Joe Biden did nothing to push away this socialist idea that was tagged onto him. But the same way that the Democratic Party cried wolf with Donald Trump in 2016 is the same thing that I've seen happen for the Republican Party in 2020. They labeled Joe Biden as a socialist. They said they would be, the American public would be under communist rule by the time that Joe Biden is inaugurated. That Joe Biden's power will bring in China. Joe Biden's power will bring in communism. And when that doesn't happen, because it's absolutely not going to happen, any Bernie Sanders supporter can tell you that. Any left-wing Democrat can tell you that. It's absolutely not going to happen because that's not what Joe Biden has said. Now, defund the police rhetoric never once been spoken out of Joe Biden's mouth. But for some reason, it's tagged onto him every single time. And I think that's something that's really going to hurt the Republican Party moving forward. It may have worked in this election, but when that doesn't happen, people are going to realize that that messaging was false. And they're not going to return to the Republican Party the same way they did in 2016 or 2020. They are not going to be happy that the entire messaging from the Trump campaign was that Joe Biden is a socialist. And when there isn't Medicare for all, and when there isn't a number of left-wing policies enacted, where's that argument going to come from? Next 4 years he'll become a socialist? It's not going to work. It's not something that's going to work. The same way it didn't work for the Democrats, really, this election, to try to use the same exact playbook from 2016. Maybe if they did entirely, they could have won better amongst minority voters, but at the expense of losing white voters, upcoming election, these minority voters had already been Democratic voters. It's not too surprising to see them return, especially with that messaging. Probably isn't going to work too well. It's not going to work after 4 years of being realistic, nothing super significant happening if the Republican Party controls the Senate. Absolutely nothing's going to happen. And the Republican Party probably will pick up the House in 2022. So I don't expect Joe Biden to have this revolutionizing, administration. It's probably going to be more of the same. And that's something that a lot of Americans actually wanted. They didn't want to be worried about President Trump. They didn't want to be worried about an administration. So in turn, they voted for Joe Biden. But looking at this playbook that was used by the Republican Party, I think they're making the same mistakes that the Democratic Party did in 2016, which is why in 2024, I think that the Democratic Party could win over more minority voters than they did this election and also retain white voters and in turn win a number of states enough that they could actually flip states that haven't flipped in decades, the same way they did in Arizona and Georgia in this election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.